So the Las Vegas Raiders have a very interesting decision to make as they kind of go into the offseason. Obviously, we have one game left against the Chargers coming up this Sunday. But once that game ends, the Raiders have to start thinking about the future of this team. Antonio Pierce is one aspect of it, but another aspect will be basically which quarterback you're going to move forward with. And I think the quarterback discussion is a very, very interesting discussion, especially after some news that we kind of heard yesterday coming from Dane Brugler, who works as a draft analyst for The Athletic. He had an article that he kind of put out there, and within that article, he put an interesting piece in it, basically saying that he got a comment from one AFC scout who said, man, I feel bad for the teams trying to find even one quarterback in this group. It's interesting because a lot of the people that I've spoken to up to this point really just have Cam Ward as the QB1. That too, they're not 100% sure if he's, the guy that, and if he has QB1, he'll obviously be the first overall pick. But people are not sure right now if Cam Ward's even going to be a good quarterback in the NFL. Let alone guys like Jalen Monroe and Shedeur Sanders, who some people think shouldn't even be drafted anywhere in the first round, right? And that's kind of what we're hearing a lot about with the quarterback class that's coming out this year, right? People are saying this quarterback class is a really, really bad class. And that does happen, right? Let's just be honest. We got 6 quarterbacks taken last year in the first round. It's going to happen now where there's not a lot of quarterbacks left. And of course, if the Raiders really, really wanted a quarterback, they should have traded up for one last year. And I think that would have made the most logical sense. But obviously, we also have to realize that it's not as easy as actually trading up, right? If a team says, hey, you want the 5th overall pick, you got to send me 3 first-round picks. It's not easy to just make that decision and say, let's, mortgage our future to get this one position, especially when you're a team that might have other positions in need, right? And the approach that the Raiders took last week, or say last year, was the best player available approach. And that approach obviously worked, right? Because we not only got Brock Bowers, but we also got Jackson Powers-Johnson in the second. And I think as we go into this upcoming offseason, we're going to have some interesting decisions. And we're going to talk about that today, right? I want to talk about what the Raiders can realistically do going into this next season, right? What this scout is telling Dane Brugler that he feels bad for any team that needs a quarterback. Just even trying to find one, right? Because among this group, it's very, very difficult. I'm hearing the same thing, right? There's one quarterback that'll go in the first round. Every other quarterback is not worthy of being a first-round pick. Now, that doesn't mean it's guaranteed we're not going to get another quarterback or a third quarterback to be taken, right? Because teams that are desperate for a quarterback will still end up reaching and taking a quarterback. But I think when you're the Raiders and you're in this situation, you got to realistically think about other options, right? And that's what we're going to kind of focus in on. Last year, the best player available approach kind of worked for the Raiders. And I wouldn't mind taking that same approach this year. If the Raiders had the 8th overall pick, and let's say you have a list of guys you can take with that pick. Let's say Ashton Genty's available. Let's say Abdul Carter's available. Maybe it's Josh Connerly, the tackle out of Oregon. Or maybe it's Will Johnson, the corner out of Michigan. I think the Raiders got to realistically consider taking the best player available at that pick. And then coming back into the second round and potentially taking a quarterback. Now, I did a mock draft just the other day, and in this mock draft, I kind of took that approach where I came back and said, let's take a quarterback in the second round. I think this actually makes the most logical sense for the Raiders. Now, it might not actually be Jalen Monroe, to be honest with you. I think Monroe has upside, but he's still kind of raw, right? I think we kind of have seen that over the course of the season. But the Raiders could easily say, hey, let's go with Will Johnson, who long-term could become one of the best corners in the NFL, right? We saw the Denver Broncos take Patrick Surtain a couple years back. Even though they needed a quarterback, they went the opposite approach. They kind of took the best player available at that point. And Patrick Surtain's obviously worked out for them, right? On the other end, you got the Raiders who can potentially take that same approach and say, let's get a cornerback in Will Johnson. Now, I have some thoughts on Ashton Genty, who's also kind of available at that pick that ended up not taking. We'll talk about him a little bit later on because I'm kind of hesitant with a guy like Genty. We'll talk about why here in a second. But I think for the Raiders, you can go with the best player available approach. You can take a quarterback in the second round. And then even more than that, you can take a running back in the third round. This class here, when it comes to running backs, is super, super deep. I slotted in RJ Harvey. I don't think he's actually going to be there when the 70th pick actually rolls around. I think RJ Harvey is a borderline first-round pick. I think he will probably end up going in the top 45 to 60 picks, but I think he's a borderline first-round pick. And I think as you kind of get into this draft, you really got to think if you want to take a quarterback in the second round, a guy with high upside, or alternatively, right? And putting this mock draft to the side, There are quarterbacks the Raiders can actually target in this offseason. There's quarterbacks first and foremost outside of the draft, right? Guys that you can actually bring in. Guys like Dak Prescott may actually be available. Guys like Kirk Cousins, right? Kirk Cousins has already been replaced at this point. Most likely he'll end up becoming a free agent. So he's a guy you might be able to target. If it's not Kirk Cousins, if it's not Dak Prescott, the Cowboys might not actually move off of Dak. If it's not Dak, if it's not Kirk, maybe you go with the younger option, a guy like Sam Darnold. Now, I don't personally think Sam Darnold's going to be available. I know a lot of Raider fans are like, make the call for Sam Darnold, do what it takes to bring him in. Finding a quarterback's a hard position to find, and the Vikings might have actually found one with Sam Darnold, so they're not going to trade this guy now. In fact, I think if the Vikings were going to move off of one of their quarterbacks, they'd probably move off of J.J. McCarthy before they move off of Sam Darnold, because with Darnold at, only 26 years old, this guy's a legit quarterback. We don't know that with J.J. McCarthy, and although J.J. McCarthy was a top 10 pick, it's not guaranteed that J.J. McCarthy ultimately ends up being as good as what Sam Darnold has shown us this year. So I think another option for the Raiders, of course, would then be to theoretically go out and get J.J. McCarthy. I wouldn't be mad or upset if the Raiders actually went out and said, hey, let's trade a pick for J.J. McCarthy. Now, is he worth the 8th overall pick if the Raiders end up having that? I think that's debatable. I'd say probably not, because of the fact that, the pick is always more valuable than the player. And I think with J.J. McCarthy, although it is a quarterback, I also am not 100% sure he's now worth the 8th overall pick. Now, of course, the fact that there's not a lot of quarterbacks in this class, there's not a lot of quarterbacks available. Maybe the Raiders do say it's worth the 8th overall pick to trade for J.J. McCarthy. Now, I would be okay if the Raiders wanted to trade for J.J. McCarthy. I would definitely try bringing him in. Is he worth the first round pick? That too, the 8th or 7th overall pick is debatable. But J.J. McCarthy's another guy you can potentially go out and get. And then there's a couple other guys that are kind of available or might become available, guys like Matthew Stafford. Although the Rams are having success, some people do think that Sean McVay wants to move off of Matt Stafford. So there's some aging quarterbacks that are kind of available at that point. There's some younger quarterbacks that haven't really worked out, where some people are going to say, hey, maybe the Raiders should give these guys another opportunity. Justin Fields, Trey Lance, Zach Wilson, right? We saw Baker Mayfield. We saw Geno Smith. We saw obviously Sam Darnold as well. All kind of have success going into like year 4, 5, and 6. So why couldn't some of these other quarterbacks have that same success, right? And I do agree with that approach as well. I think the Raiders should be, considering to get one of these other quarterbacks. And I guess the other option also would be just to stick with Gardner Minshew as well as Aiden O'Connell. Of course, going into this season, it'd probably be Aiden O'Connell that gets the start, but I'd also like to see what Gardner Minshew would be able to do with Scott Turner as his offensive coordinator, as opposed to Luke Getsy. I know some people are going to say Gardner Minshew was a terrible quarterback. I think the worst thing the Raiders had this season was not their quarterback, it was actually their offensive coordinator. I think Scott Turner's kind of proven that, although we have been hurt and hasn't been as good. Scott Turner's a much better offensive coordinator than Luke Getsy is, and I think all of us kind of see that. Or at least if you watch the games and pay attention, you probably see that as well. But the Raiders do have all these different options. You can get a vet, you can stick with what you kind of have, and then you can also potentially draft a quarterback in the second round. Now, when I did my mock draft, I said Jalen Milroe makes the most sense. I also would not be mad if the Raiders said, hey, Jackson Dart might be worth the second or third round pick. Let's go after him and see what he could potentially do. And the thing with those quarterbacks is you're not going to start them day one, right? You probably roll forward with Aiden O'Connell or Minshew, whichever guy ends up winning the job. And if those guys, are 2 and 7, then you could put that rookie in and say, let's see if this rookie can do anything. And if those, that quarterback continues to struggle, well, then maybe you'll have a high enough pick next year and get a quarterback in next year's class. Garrett Nussmeier, who is going back to school for LSU, he's already declared he's going to go back to school, is having a really, really good game right now. He has 3 touchdowns at the half. We'll see how he finishes that game. Drew Aller of Penn State is also going to go back. Drew Aller might be the first overall pick next year. It kind of sucks if you need a quarterback this year that those 2 guys did not come out, because some people think those 2 guys would have been picked higher than the guys that are coming out, right? Guys like Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders. Right? People think Drew Aller would have been the number 1 overall pick had he came out this year. And I kind of agree with what we've seen from those 2 guys. But we'll see what ends up happening, right? And, I do want to also just kind of wrap this video up talking about if you do go with the quarterback in the second round option, right, there's a bunch of guys that are going to come out, right? Carson Beck has already declared that he's coming out. Jalen Monroe will probably declare within the next 2 days if he's going to come out or not. I think it would be smart for Monroe himself specifically to go back to school for one more year, but you never know, right? And then you also do obviously have Cam Ward and Shador who are 100% coming out as well. You got some guys like Brady Cook. I think Brady Cook's another interesting option. Although Brady Cook isn't, the high profile guy that we have with some of these other guys, I think Brady Cook's an interesting player as well, right? Played in the SEC, has won a ton of games, right? Went to Missouri, obviously, has had a lot of success there. They've won pretty much 10 or 11 games every season that he's been there. He has I forget the exact number, but it was something crazy, right? It has over 40 touchdowns over the last 2 years. A very, very low amount of turnovers as well, right? So he's another guy you can potentially target in the second or third round, if not even later, potentially. Let's wrap it up though. Let's talk about the best player available approach, right? Because I think we're at the point where people are starting to project guys in the top 10 that I don't think are actually going to go in the top 10, right? I think guys like Will Campbell out of LSU at the offensive tackle. I think the Michigan defensive tackle Mason Graham. I think these guys are going to go a lot lower than where they're being projected. Some of these guys are being projected as the number one overall pick. That makes no sense to me. I don't think either of those two guys go top 10. I'd be surprised if both of them actually both end up going in the first round, to be honest with you guys. But we're going to start to find out which guys are being ranked kind of where over the next, I'd say 4 to 5 months. As the draft actually kind of gets closer, we'll probably find out a lot about where teams are kind of valuing some of these guys. But, if you're the Raiders and you say, okay, what do we really need at this moment? I think if you're the Las Vegas Raiders, outside of quarterback, I think you got to get a wide receiver and you got to get a running back, right? I think you have to hit on those two positions. In fact, I think for the Raiders, I wouldn't be surprised if we drafted 2 running backs in this class specifically. This running back class is the deepest I think, we're going to have. In the last 14 to 15 years, this class right here is going to be the best, right? There's just no other class that's going to come close to it. I talked about RJ Harvey a little bit, but RJ Harvey of UCF is a very, very, very good running back. In fact, I'll just pull up some of these numbers. Ashton Genty's the guy that a lot of people are like, hey, he has to be the guy you take, right? He's a top 5 worthy pick. I kind of disagree with that a little bit. Not that I don't think Ashton Genty can be a really, really good running back, but the amount of yards he has also comes down to the fact that the amount of carries he had, right? 345 attempts is a ridiculous amount of attempts. If you take the yards per attempt approach, he ranked 4th, and that's still pretty good, right? That's still almost at the highest that you would have, but consider this: Travion Henderson averaged 6.9 yards per attempt. That's just a little bit less than where Ashton Genty was. RJ Harvey 6.8, right? And again, I think Ohio State and UCF also play a lot harder competition than Ashton Genty. And I'm not knocking Genty by any means, but there's a lot of good running backs that are coming out this year. And I think for the Raiders, taking a running back with a top 10 pick just doesn't make sense, right? Especially considering the fact that you can potentially still get a running back in the second round. That's maybe not as good as Ashton Genty, but he'll be very, very close. Also, let's not overlook the fact that Ashton Genty is listed at 5'7". If he actually truly does end up measuring at 5'7", I would find it hard to believe that a team's going to take this guy in the top 15 picks. I don't think any running back that's 5'7" has ever had the type of success that you would expect taking a guy in the top 15 picks, essentially, right? To me, if I'm a team looking for a running back, I think the second to third round is going to be a sweet spot for taking some of these guys. RJ Harvey of UCF is a guy that's going to get a lot of looks. Miami has another running back as well that I think could be legit, Damian Martinez, although I don't think he's going to be ranked very high. Caleb Johnson of Iowa is probably I think if you're going to rank the top 3, it's going to be Ashton Genty, RJ Harvey, Caleb Johnson. Those are going to be the top 3 running backs that are going to come out. All 3 of them can actually be first round picks. Also, don't be surprised if Ashton Genty is not the first running back taken. I know a lot of people are 100% like, this guy's a top 10 pick. Don't be surprised if he's not, right? I've heard from some very, very solid scouts, people that actually know what they're talking about, that they don't think Ashton Genty is going to get picked nearly as high as where the hype kind of is right now. And a part of that comes down to the fact that the size the competition he plays with, and the amount of carries that he had, right? All of those things are kind of red flags for certain teams out there. So don't be surprised if that actually ends up happening. Again, I'm not saying I don't like Ashton Jeanty. I think he'll be a good football player. I just think with the, having arguably the deepest running back class that we've seen in a long time, it just doesn't make sense to take a running back in the top 10. That too, you got to realistically consider the positional, the position of needs, right? Relative to positions that really impact the team, right? With Brock Bowers being considered a generational player, most of the time when you're a generational player, you go top 3 or 4, right? Oftentimes you're not falling the way Brock Bowers does, especially with the guy that has zero character concerns. He's a hard worker. He's a great person. You don't go 13th overall unless you play a position that really doesn't matter a whole lot, right? And tight end's one of those positions. Just be honest. It is what it is. As is safety, right? As are some other positions like linebackers, right? That's why linebackers aren't generally going in the first round anymore. Same with safeties, same with tight ends. Running back's kind of that same position as well. So if I'm the Raiders, I'm not taking a running back in the top 10, but I would consider taking the number 1 corner. And in this instance, Will Johnson's going to be the number 1 cornerback. I'd also consider taking the number 1 edge player. I think there's a couple of guys that can be the number 1 edge this year. I think Abdul Carter is the favorite right now to be the number 1 edge, although I'm not 100% sure I agree with that. I think Josiah Stewart of Michigan's had a really, really, really monstrous year. And then Marshall has a guy named Mike Green, who I think could also end up being the number 1 edge player. Is he from Marshall? I think he is from Marshall. I think he's another guy that could be the number 1 pick. So I know the Raiders don't really need edge, but it is a position where I think the value of it's a lot higher. Defensive tackle is another position you could take in the top 10, but I don't know if I would take any of these guys in the top 10, right? I don't think these D tackles are nearly as good prospects as we saw guys like Jalen Carter and a couple other guys over the past couple of years. But the Raiders could also consider taking a wide receiver. Obviously, I think Travis Hunter's the best wide receiver in this class. Tetro McMillan's not far behind him, and they're different players, right? Hunter's a playmaker. He's explosive. McMillan's like 6'5". He's long. He's massive. He's kind of like Drake London. Drake London surprised a lot of people being taken as high as he was, I think, a couple years back. But it makes sense because that size is hard to stop and it's hard to cover, especially in a wide receiver body. You don't get a lot of 6'5" wide receivers, and McMillan's long. He's big. Some people are comparing him to like that Calvin Johnson type mold, although he's not as good as Calvin Johnson, but he's another guy I would take, especially considering the Raiders need a true X wide receiver, right? Now, of course, you can target T. Higgins in free agency, so we'll see if that actually impacts this. But Tetro McMillan's another guy you could potentially target, right? Of course, I would love to get Travis Hunter, but Travis Hunter is not going to be available. Truth be told, he's going to be the first non-quarterback taken. And then you can also potentially take an offensive tackle. I think Josh Connerly is a great player to potentially take. If you take a true starting offensive tackle, right, like Josh Connerly, I think Kelvin Banks is probably also a real tackle in this class. Josh Simmons. If the Raiders take one of these tackles, what that means is you put those guys in at right tackle. And then that also means DJ Glaze slides into the inside. I think DJ Glaze as a guard is going to be a really, really, really good guard. As a tackle, I think he can probably still work, and I would hesitate to draft the tackle until we 100% know if DJ Glaze is the guy or not. But you could still go down the route where you take Josh Connerly and ultimately put him at tackle and slide DJ Glaze to the inside. I think those are some of the positional, positions that you can potentially target in the top 10. Corners, receivers, defensive line, obviously quarterback, and something tells me that the draft's gonna start. We're gonna see Cam Ward go 1. We'll start to see all these other non-quarterbacks taken. The Raiders gonna be on the clock at pick 7 or 8, and Shedeur Sanders gonna be right there for us. And something tells me we're gonna end up skipping them, right? And I'm not saying I would do that. To be honest, you guys, I'd rather go into this season with Shedeur Sanders than not. Especially even if it's a top 10 pick. But something tells me that teams with this class specifically do not like this class. And I think teams would rather say, hey, if we can get Penei Sewell, let's take Penei Sewell. If we could get the next Nick Bosa, let's take Nick Bosa. Right? Why waste this pick and take a quarterback like Justin Fields or Kenny Pickett? Why waste a pick when we can end up getting one of these guys that can actually make a difference? and maybe wait until next year to ultimately get that. So we'll see what actually ends up happening. It's going to be an interesting year. The Raiders obviously have to figure out the strategy that they're going to take as they kind of go into this season. I wanted to kind of make a video where I start talking about the draft a little bit. Next week, I'll be at the Hula Bowl, actually in Florida at the Hula Bowl. So I probably won't make content during the actual week next week, but the draft process is here, right? And I think at some point we'll get into an actual video where I talk about all the different prospects, because there's a lot of really, really, really good prospects coming out this year. There's a lot of true interior offensive linemen that can make a difference. There's a lot of good wide receivers. There's a lot of good running backs. And I think running backs this year, we're going to get like 10 guys that are going to end up having really, really good NFL careers. So it's going to be an interesting year, man. We'll see what ends up happening. Let me know what you guys would do if you guys were the general manager of the Las Vegas Raiders. Thumbs up, subscribe, and I will see you guys next time with another video.